Okay, so let's start off by having you. We've had you on the show before, but people who are watching right now might have not seen that. So let's start off by having you introduce yourself and just talk a little bit about your public career.
Not entirely sure why I should cater to fake fans who haven't been following you.
You know, I think that's a good point. In fact, maybe we should put this part in behind a paywall, where only those who donate and become a sub can access the true lore behind you. Were you the one whispering in Zelensky's ear? Do you control the Labour Party in Australia? People don't know. People have no clue.
I was actually whispering in Prigozhin's ear. Should have whispered harder. But no, my name's Dmitry Grozoubinski. I was born in Ukraine, but I served as an Australian diplomat for about 7 years. And these days I am a specialist in international trade. I just released a book called Why Politicians Lie About Trade and What You Need to Know About It. Basically make my living talking about trade policy, teaching negotiators how to do it, teaching companies how to negotiate and how trade works. And Dylan has me on because, I don't know, hopefully good bants.
Oh, fantastic banter. And also because I have a lot of questions, because a lot has happened since we've last had a conversation. Not only when it comes to, of course, the war in Ukraine, which is a topic we both have extreme interest in, of course. But I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about some economic policies, some trade policies that were proposed recently on the campaign trail. Can we actually start with that before we got into the foreign affairs?
Yeah.
What do you?
Absolutely. We can also just dunk on JD Vance for like 40 minutes.
Were you watching some of the pre-show a little bit?
Oh yeah.
Oh my God.
I mean, I have to say, like, the photo of somebody giving double thumbs up over the graves of soldiers who died in a war zone is one of those things that you have to take a half step back and go, outside of this weird post-Trumpian period, that wouldn't have just been like campaign ending. If you had had that kind of photo in like 1992, you would have had to disband one of the US major political parties.
I mean,
like, whoever did that would just be like, well, we're just no longer relevant in politics anymore. No one will ever forgive us for this.
I mean, this,
now you just kind of get memory hold. It's insane.
That's the type of thing I would do next to the grave of somebody I'd be happy was dead, right? And it'd be like I'd be next to Putin's grave giving a thumbs up, like, I'm happy about it. It's just a weird all around. I understand they're all like happy and like hugging. They're trying to, you know, maybe have like a remembrance of life, but it was very strange doing it and around section 60, which is where the most recent war dead is buried, many of whom he does not know and does not want the pictures of him campaigning next to their like children's headstones. It's wild.
So what it reminds me of is in Geneva, where I live, there is one of the headquarters of the United Nations where like the Human Rights Council is, and opposite it is a place called Nation, where there is a giant statue of it's a giant chair with 3 legs, and the 4th leg is like severed halfway up. And it's ginormous, and it's like one of the big statues of Geneva that people go and take photos with. The thing is, if you go right up to it and look at the plaque, you will see that it is a monument to landmine victims. The 4th leg is sort of it's meant to be a severed limb, so it's quite a somber monument. But people don't realize that, and so every single day there are like smiling Japanese tourists throwing up the like double kawaii victory symbols and smiling ear to ear next to this like quite tragic monument. But like, that is genuinely semi-obscure knowledge about Geneva. You can be absolutely forgiven for seeing that and going, that's just a cool chair, I'm going to take a photo with it, it's an iconic photo to take home. Section 60 of Arlington Cemetery isn't exactly in that ballpark.
It's like, it's the most sacred location in the United States. If I was to think like, when people talk about like making buildings on old burial grounds and getting haunted, if there's anywhere where there are ghosts that'll haunt you, it's like, this is the most sacred ground in the United States. Out of all the places to have a scandal or to start shoving staff. I mean, I remember when Lauren Boebert was like scuffling with staff at that one theater during the Beetlejuice play. That was a political scandal. This is now Arlington National Cemetery. I don't know. Like, I couldn't have chosen. Who would it have been worse for him to get in like a scuffle with? I don't know. Like a restaurant staffed mainly by dementia patients. Like, I have no clue. Like, I couldn't think of anything that would be more acidic to a campaign.
It is yet another one of those things where if you saw it in a political, like in a HBO drama, if this was a subplot of House of Cards, you'd be like, the writers are really phoning this in. They've made this person cartoonishly evil and stupid. Come on, people don't work that way. Let's kind of come back to reality. And then this is just the news every couple of days. It is mind-boggling. I have a lot of sympathy for my colleagues who are now in Washington, D.C., whose job it is to report on this, and who have to basically send cables back to Canberra or, every capital on Earth, being like, so, you guys aren't going to believe what just happened, but I swear to God it's real, and I'd have to provide some kind of analysis on top of that.
I feel like I would need like
just consist of crying.
At that point, there has to be like a key default on their computer. Like, you do Shift Z, and it has like the default entered. Like, you're not going to believe this insane turn of events. Just like the starting paragraph at this point, because they've done it again and again and again in the last 2 months. So many crazy news updates.
That would be convenient if most governments didn't run on IT from like 1989, and keyboard shortcuts are way too many bridges too far for your average foreign ministry.
So I want to talk to you about a few of the, well, really just one campaign proposal that I've seen get attention, and I was like, this campaign question is perfect for you. I'm hearing people talk about tariffs again in the United States, and it's not just tariffs from like a strategic use of we're going to build up a key industry, but tariffs as just a guiding policy of economic change. That if we put the Trump campaign is proposing a 10% tariffs on all goods that enter the United States. Now, that's just the first tariff. There'd be other tariffs on Chinese goods, higher tariffs specifically for Chinese goods, which of course is a gigantic economy that the United States trades with. And a lot of this does not seem to really have a strategic end, but it means to have an economic end by introducing more production back to the United States, made in America, make in America, that idea. What do you think the economic impact of a policy like this could be?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's kind of helpful to take a step back and sort of think through this step by step, because this is going to be a big part of everybody's life now. Tariffs, for those who don't follow this stuff day to day, are basically just import taxes. You can kind of just think of them as like a little bit like patriotism taxes, where basically what we do is anytime somebody wants to bring a certain kind of product into the country.
Can I one quick question? I'm sorry to interrupt immediately, but Harris keeps on the campaign trail saying this is because she doesn't want to go in and have to explain tariffs to everybody. So she's basically saying it's a de facto sales tax. That's what she keeps calling it. Can you call it that? And is that honest?
I mean, it's close enough to honest. In practice, you apply it at a different point. So sales tax is kind of applied basically at the checkout, whereas tariffs are charged at the border on the importer. So in theory, a company could bring a product in, pay the tariff, and then not change the price it's charging customers, just kind of eat that loss. But in practice, that never happens. So in practice, it's effectively a sales tax. It's just a sales tax that only applies to foreign goods. So the difference between sales tax and tariff is that sales tax, if there's a 10% sales tax on apples, it doesn't matter if those apples were from California or from Australia, whereas a tariff would hit just the Australian apples and leave the California tariffs alone. And the logic behind them is really that all you're trying to do is make foreign stuff less competitive. The logic is if the tariff wasn't there, American consumers would buy foreign stuff because it is the best value on the market in their perception. So in order to change that equation, you start basically taxing them for that privilege to make American goods more competitive by comparison. And like the long-term logic is if you do that hard enough, eventually someone's going to build more stuff in America to make things because there'll be a competitive advantage in it. You'll be able to compete because you'll be protected from foreign competition by these tariffs. Like that's kind of the logic. The direct net result is that stuff becomes more expensive, and stuff becomes more expensive for you as a consumer, like a normal person at the shops, but it also becomes more expensive for American businesses that make and consume things. So it becomes harder to have a car factory that brings in a German motor and then puts it into an American car because that German motor gets more expensive. So the ability of even American firms to put together the best value product by finding the best options anywhere in the world and then bringing them back to the US also takes a hit. And then finally, other countries tend to retaliate when you do this kind of thing. So they start charging their consumers a tariff for buying American goods. So those American companies that ship stuff abroad start finding that they're getting caught in the crossfire. They're getting hit and they become less competitive as other countries punch back against the US.
So Trump did institute some tariffs during his time in office. It seemed to be, though, it was more selective than as it was now. It was mostly focused on China and like steel tariffs and some aluminum tariffs. And there was also like an argument, a strategic argument of these are core industries that if we do not have in the United States at a time of war. And so you could argue that the logic is different there than an all around 10% tariff. What is there any logic to the idea that there could be, because I've heard people say this, that the jobs produced domestically will make a better, we'll have better jobs here and then we'll have more consumers here and it'll help us more down in the long run. Has it ever been the case, or do you think that could be the case?
I mean, there's two like really separate things. So I might do the second one first. It's a really there is this idea that like maybe if we tariff hard enough and we create enough like manufacturing jobs in the US, then on aggregate, even if consumers are paying more at the shops, on aggregate, the country's like richer and better off.
That's the idea,
insane.
Yes. Yeah.
That's completely insane just on the numbers. Very, very, very few Americans work in manufacturing. Even if that number went up by like 300%, they would still be outnumbered by consumers like 40-1. Because the US has a lot more people who don't work in manufacturing than people who do. So,
sorry, I was somebody asked me a question. Can you say that last part again?
Sure. So basically, because most Americans do not and will never work at a factory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're hitting all of those guys when you implement tariffs. Like everybody in the country starts paying more for just about everything.
Mm-hmm.
You're hurting a lot more people than you could ever conceivably help.
Yeah.
Even if you created an extra manufacturing job for every manufacturing job that currently exists in the country, that's like you've helped, I don't know, 2 million people out of 400 million.
And what gets me is like a lot of these manufacturing jobs, like the ones that we do well in the United States, they're much more specialized. It's not, but also like I remember now I know more about the defense sector than other sectors. I know when they wanted to bring back Stinger production, it wasn't as simple as like, okay, come over here, we're hiring you, you're gonna come back, anybody off the street, Jim, Bob, or because they don't know how to make stingers. And they had to get a bunch of people out of retirement who haven't made stingers forever to go start making these stingers. And I would imagine that for a lot of these like, goods that we're putting 10% tariffs on, which we just don't have the people trained in the United States to produce these, that it's going to take time to, get people trained. That's going to be a gap before you can even have the solution. If you're putting 10% good, I mean, if you're just doing a blanket tariff on everything, then eventually there's going to have to be either A, people are just going to pay more. Well, everyone's going to pay more no matter what. But if there's no domestic solution for that, then what's even the benefit for like an overall tariff? Why not be more precise? What's the potential upside here?
We'll see. This is part of the issue. Like a 10% tariff, 10% is a really strange number because 10% is on the one hand, like when you apply it that broadly, it's broad enough to be inflationary. Because if suddenly everything from abroad is 10% more expensive, like that is in the aggregate going to drive up prices a bit. But it's also very unlikely to motivate anybody to like move production. Because if you think about a 10% price difference at the border, that's already just a part of what you pay at the store. That is the sort of thing that would often get eaten up by like currency fluctuations. So like the yuan depreciates like 12% against the dollar, and then prices go up by 12% anyway. So 10% is so small that it's very unlikely that anybody's going to be like, right, okay, they've instituted a 10% tariff. I'm going to spend $400 million and 8 years moving my production from Vietnam to Minnesota if I wasn't already going to do that for other reasons. So it's probably like not enough to get anybody to move a factory, but it is, because you've like applied it everywhere, it is enough to add a lot of bureaucracy and pain and inflation to the economy. So it is a bit weird. Now there is something, you were talking about the defense industry before. There is certainly something to the argument to sort of like unspool out that like, okay, in a hypothetical scenario where the US suddenly finds itself fighting like a conventional grinding industrial war. So what people, I guess, are picturing is something like Russia-Ukraine, but against China in the South China Sea. Like that is what people are subtextually saying. The argument goes like, it doesn't matter how good the US is at like management consulting, finance, and art. The US is gonna need a lot of engineers and like factories that it can convert to making warships and munitions. And that is easier to do when you already have a lot of factories doing other things. So when you were talking about getting guys out of retirement to make stingers, like it is easier to do that if you've got a lot of guys who have made something. Teaching a person who used to be making tractors how to make Abrams tanks is less of a lift than getting somebody who used to be an auditor for Deloitte and teaching them how to make Abrams. So that's kind of the strategic thinking. What I tend to say to people is like, that kind of makes sense in a meta way, but if you're really anticipating the US having to do this, and like you want to be the US to be ready on day one, the level of transformation to the current US economy is so staggering no one would ever contemplate it. You'd have to like fundamentally change how the US economy currently works in order to have it be like at any time we can flip a switch and be pumping out 3 warships a week. And no one's prepared to do that. So instead, you have the situation where people are reaching for that logic, but only really selectively to justify individual things that they want to do anyway. So Trump wants to slap tariffs on people he doesn't like. And so when he needs to defend it, he goes, yeah, well, what if we need to fight World War III? Actually, the Biden administration has occasionally done the same thing. Like, why are we slapping tariffs on photovoltaics, on solar panels? Like, well, what if we need to fight World War III? It's like, well, I don't think solar panels are what you're going to fight World War III with, but they want to do it, and so they reach for that logic.
I remember, and this is not on the campaign, but this is something I've been interested in. Before we move over to, Ukraine, diplomatic red lines, etc. I was thinking about, I remember NAFTA. No, it wasn't NAFTA. It was, what was that part? It was a trade agreement in Asia that the Clinton was in favor of. Obama they were talking about doing it, but eventually the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There was one part in that I liked that had to do with the increasing of labor protections and standards in Asia in order for them to be introduced to a trade agreement, with the idea being that they didn't want American domestic workers to be undercut so much by a lack of worker protections in other countries that everyone's going to go overseas where you could treat workers with not the same standards that we have here and make a lot more money. Now, you could argue that they weren't strong enough. There's a bunch of arguments you could have. I know Labor argued about it a lot. But is there an argument that something like that could be maybe more constructive towards trying to bring more work back to the United States if people thought, well, I couldn't take advantage of this overseas because of this trade arrangement? Or do you think this was a beneficial framework?
This is a really interesting concept. Like the way that this kind of works is rich countries, America, Europe, have a lot of really wealthy consumers that buy a lot of shit. So being able to sell Americans or Europeans stuff is really lucrative for foreign countries. And therefore, when you're negotiating with them as the US or the European Union, you have a lot of leverage. And so you can push things like union protections on other countries and trade access to your market for them. Pardon me. It's an interesting framework. It's an interesting idea that sort of the European Union does a lot of. It's really, really hard in practice because, first of all, developing countries or the countries that are entering into these kind of agreements are really aware that rich countries don't particularly want to compete with them and are looking for an excuse to shut them out. And this happens on environment, this happens on labor. Their big thing is like, what you're going to say is that unless my factory looks exactly like one from Sweden, with all of the high-tech gadgets, the high wage costs, the high labor costs, the union protections, the 17 weeks of holiday or whatever Swedes get, you can't sell me anything. This is what developing countries are like, we can't do that. So you're just going to use this to lock us out of your market and be protectionist. So they push back on it. And secondly, there are huge monitoring problems. Like how do you know what's really happening in a factory on the other side of the world? We still can't really work out where in Shenzhen is using child labor or using prison labor. We've got some guesses about which parts of the Chinese economy might be leaning on that kind of thing, but we're mostly just sort of cobbling it together from rumors. So part of the challenge with this kind of stuff is like, you can write whatever you want into an agreement, but practically, how do you really control what a boss says to a potential union organizer on the floor of a factory in Laos?
So I wanted to move over to red lines because since we've last talked, the conversation around red lines has fundamentally shifted. Since Ukraine has invaded Russia, there was, of course, before this, there was discussion about, Russia's territorial integrity. That being the clearest red line we could discuss is the idea that, the red line around sending jets might not have been as sturdy as some people thought. The red line around long-range missiles might have not been as sturdy. And, a lot of these red lines not have been as sturdy, but Russia's territorial integrity has always been their red line for the use of nuclear weapons. So that should be, has it not been their red line for the use of nuclear weapons? Is the idea that...
No. So I want to push back on that.
Okay.
The Russian nuclear doctrine has been very, very, very consistent pretty much for like 5 decades, which is that their nuclear doctrine is, if there are the two conditions under which they will employ nuclear weapons, absent like being hit with nuclear weapons, are firstly, if there is a threat to the existence of the Russian state, and second, if there is a threat to the Russian nuclear arsenal in sort of as a whole.
I guess what I meant was, I think that former, many people would have thought at a direct invasion into Russia, capturing Russian villages, capturing Russian cities, capturing Russian towns, would have been considered a direct threat to the Russian state, i.e. as in probably like Chinese troops landing next to LA would be considered a direct threat to the American state, no?
Well, it's much more like, if, like, given the size of Russia, it's like if a contingent of 30,000 Chinese troops landed on, I'm trying to think, like, I don't know, maybe like the very tip of Florida and kind of didn't quite make it to whatever, Dade or whatever, Dade County. Like they captured 1,000 square kilometers of the US and then were kind of stopped. And there was absolutely no chance that those, what is it, like 20,000 troops were going to ever be any threat to Washington, D.C., New York, or anywhere else. Would the US end human life on Earth by immediately launching mass nukes if there was a Chinese invasion that was that small and that contained? That is how the Russians are perceiving it. It's important to remember that they do not care about their people at all. Everything outside of the imperial core in Russia, so everybody who does not live in Putin's old hood in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, and in like maybe 2 other places where these guys have their holiday dachas, is completely irrelevant to the thinking of the Russian state. They simply do not, they view them in the same way that like you view, I don't know, individual zerglings from your 4th expansion in a StarCraft game. They are not that invested in them. And so I don't think that it's quite that they think about this in the same way, unless there was a genuine existential threat to the Russian state as we know it, and the Kursk invasion just doesn't rise to that level yet. Prigozhin came closer.
I don't think that it rises to the level of a threat against the Russian state, but the way that we have talked about red lines and nuclear escalation has been the idea of, and when I see Western policymakers talk about aid to Ukraine, it's through the idea of these weapons will only be used inside Ukraine. This is not a threat to Russia. This is only for defensive purposes. Russia is invading. This will be used within Ukraine. This war is all about taking back Ukraine's territory. All of it has been constrained within the general, like I guess you could say, dialogue bubble of this is all about pushing Russia out of Ukraine. The war, we're doing everything to kind of contain it to Ukraine. We're not allowing them to strike deep inside of Russia because Russia is Russia and this is not in Ukraine. And so it seemed from Western policymakers' perspective, they saw probably stuff like the Kursk operation as crossing a potential red line, which they were unsure of enough. And with Joe Biden's long history and experience in foreign policy, and with experience usually comes some hesitancy when it comes to these affairs, not always, but a lot of times, I think that they wouldn't usually have crossed this red line because they would have thought that it could be interpreted as a threat to the Russian state, the capturing of Russian villages, the occupation of Russian villages, because I think that Putin views his power as existential for the Russian state. If Putin goes down, the state goes down, Russia could go down, Russia could collapse. So if Russia's getting invaded, it causes enough disconnect, enough chaos, then you could see the disintegration of the Russian state. So I could see a way that Western policymakers could see this as enough of a threat to have stopped them from saying, okay, Ukraine, do this operation, which is why I think the Ukrainians kept it quiet. That and the leak problem, because, you know, certain Discord channels do not need any more updates.
Yeah, so I would say, like, I think maybe, I'm sure your audience is all over this, but I think it's useful to like take a half step back and look at like the Western, what is the Western actual concern about escalation? If you take like Jake Sullivan's bedwetting out of it and you sort of go, okay, how could we?
Is it Jake Sullivan?
What's happening?
People say it's Jake Sullivan, but I heard it might more be the Pentagon and Lloyd Austin.
I mean, I don't know who the hell's kvetching in there, but I think it's useful, like, what are they actually worried about happening? What have they been worried about the entire time? And the way that you could imagine escalation happening, where neither side wants World War III or wants nukes, but we somehow end up there through a series of escalating accidents, goes something like, in their minds, Ukraine hammers a bunch of high-value Russian targets with what are clearly Western weapons. Russia retaliates against sites where these things are being gathered for shipment to Ukraine. So it retaliates with, like, say, strikes on Poland, for example. That is a NATO country. There needs to be a retaliation. No one's ready to go to full spectrum war, but there is a sense that they have to do something. A flight of F-35s flies into Ukraine and launches missiles to take out some staging sites, maybe even just in Ukraine. While they're doing that, they take fire from a Su complex on Russian territory. In order to operate and have air supremacy, they have to take that out. And now you have NATO jets taking out Russian anti-missile complexes. And now we're off to the ball game, and one thing leads to another. This is kind of their grand theory of escalation. And they are constantly avoiding any scenario where Western, like NATO troops and Russian troops are firing at each other, because once you begin with that, you have to keep sort of going further to eliminate threats. This is like, what happens when you take mortar fire from outside of your control zone? You have to go and take out that mortar. And once you've taken out that mortar, you got to go further. So that's kind of their threats. So do they like this Kursk invasion? Probably not. They don't like most things, but also like this concept of red lines. It's funny because it's not actually something we used to talk about that much in diplomatic circles, just because it begs the obvious question of like, okay, like a red line and then what? Like, okay, so what are you actually going to do if you cross this red line? This is why I've always been a skeptic of like Russian nuclear weapons and going like, oh, if we piss Putin off enough, he'll nuke everything. And it's like, well,
I've been asking the same question since, I think since 2022. I've always been saying there's so many different nuclear threats and saber rattling, and there's so much stuff left up to interpretation and vague enough that you could always wiggle out of it, that it always is so non-committal that it's hard to really be that fearful of it unless there was really a tragic accident, like something really went wrong. Because I would imagine that a state like Russia or any country would want to avoid using a nuke if they could, because it could mean the annihilation of not only their state, but all their wealth, everything that's valuable to them as this, social elite, etc. And Putin doesn't want to lose his mansion as much as everybody else doesn't want to lose his mansion. And I'm thinking about it, and the only scenario where I think I would really pause and say, this is where we really need to take these threats seriously, is if Putin makes a committal threat, like, you do this, and I will nuke you. We will nuke you. This is what we will do. This is the red line. Because everything I hear is, you will feel the fire of 1,000 furies. And, you must remember that Russia is a nuclear state. A lot of like, you must remember, and we have the power, and a lot of, it's so non-committal, because if they did commit to something and then backed off of it, that would degrade their threat.
That's exactly right. Like a lot of Russian nuclear saber rattling that comes from Putin, the message is not actually about like weapon transfers or about even what Ukraine does. The subtext is, watching this war, it is very, very obvious that if NATO wanted to absolutely flatten the Russian military, or at least cause obscene amounts of casualties in a very short time, it could do so. I mean,
when we say it could do damage, but is it a question, like, it takes time to move resources into position. Are the resources in position to do how much damage do you think reasonably quickly?
I mean, listen, if Ukrainian piloted F-16s from, decades ago are able to operate in Russian airspace over Kursk, the gaps, the inadequacy of Russian air defense means that even if the only thing NATO can find itself to do was basically dominate that airspace with US piloted, US modern airframes, you could absolutely hurl Russian army back to like well past Rostov, because there would be just very little they could do about it. And a lot of Russian nuclear saber rattling is like, please remember that is not an option. That is the signal they are trying to send to the West. That is the direct signal, right? And that has been taken up, as you say, because that is a legitimate threat. If you suddenly had US F-35s doing strafing runs over suburban Moscow and dropping bombs on the, GRU headquarters, that could genuinely lead to an escalation. So that threat has worked. But as you're 1,000% right. Putin goes, "Don't do this or I'll nuke you." He can only really play that card once.
Yeah, it's the final Uno reverse card. Yeah.
Medvedev plays it all the time. Medvedev announces that they're going to nuke everybody
because no one respects him, and he's a drunk. Yeah,
he's there to do that kind of crap. Nobody cares.
Can you believe that out of all of Trump's Freudian slip, out of all of Putin's old like campaign buddies from like 1990s, he's like the last one that's still there. Like everybody else, I think there might be one, maybe two other people. Medvedev was the one who survived it all.
So Medvedev, this is going to be a deep cut, but I think Medvedev really reminds me of JD Vance, not in the drinking and the nuclear threats, but in the fact that if you like trace Medvedev's career, he just kept transforming himself into whatever Putin needed him to be at that given moment.
Chameleon.
We all lived through Medvedev, the great reformer. Right? We all lived through Medvedev, the liberal hope. He used to be known as the progressive.
Mm-hmm.
There was this sense that was like Medvedev is who you go to talk to when Putin's a bit too conservative, and he'll talk him around, and he's like the face of perestroika's past, but he's the liberal reformer. He's the guy who believes in this stuff.
Yeah.
And then he was that until Putin didn't need him to be that anymore, and now he's kind of gone cartoonishly the other way. In a very similar way to the way that JD Vance, while it was politically advantageous for him to do so, was a never Trumper who kind of disdained the Bacharach, and then he just saw what he needed to be, and he became MAGA till he dies. And I imagine if this run doesn't work out, and if he flames out 4 years from now, he's going to reemerge and he's going to be something else. I don't know. An environmentalist or something.
Maybe he'll join the Green Party. He'll be their presidential nominee. Him and Jill Stein, 2028.
Yeah,
we'll see.
Both hanging out in Moscow.
So when it comes to these red lines, then, or like the red lines that are defined by Russia or defined by West, or the red lines as we perceive them, what are the signs we should look for to tell when it's verbose chest pounding, and what are the signs we should look for to be like, this is different? There's movements in these facilities, quote unquote, or this statement right here is like, oh, this is like clearly defined details of we will strike XYZ. What should we look for?
So listen, not a nuclear strategy expert.
Yeah, but like the clear stuff, diplomatically.
Let me speculate wildly. So I think the useful things to look for are, first of all, as you said, specificity. Is as soon as they start sort of naming very specific actions and very specific consequences, that is the first moment you should perk your ear up. While everybody is talking in 5 levels of abstraction, that suggests that they're not yet prepared to cross red lines. Secondly, you have to remember that these two countries could nuke each other and all of humanity out of existence at any time. There's a lot of sort of focus on are they doing military exercises involving nukes, or have they moved to the Russian equivalent of DEFCON 3 from DEFCON 4? But the fundamental kind of barrier to ICBMs flying every which way is not technical readiness. It is the fundamental unwillingness of people on both sides to die in nuclear fire over anything that is currently on the table. So for me, a very useful framework is looking at any given situation and saying, do I think that from Putin's perspective, the consequences of what's happening here are worse than dying in nuclear fire and losing everything he loves? Remembering that this is a guy who is so paranoid about dying, he disarms the guards at military funerals, sits 5,000 feet away from people during COVID, and is generally and runs away from Moscow when Prigozhin gets to within 25 miles.
Man, we haven't moved that far from. It reminds me of during the start of the German invasion, how the Soviets didn't have their military planes loaded up with ammunition and gasoline because there was fear of military revolt, and they wanted to have like speed bumps in the way of the army moving quickly.
I mean, among several other Stalin genius strategic moves in 41. Yes.
Center left, that Stalin fella. A little bit more to the left.
Lib Dem.
Lib Dem.
He codes Lib Dem.
Yes, yes.
Probably a Yimby.
He would have supported Macron. I wanted to ask you about long-range strikes in reference to this red line policy, because some have argued that part of the reason Ukraine might have done this, I mean, obviously there's been a big morale boost from the invasion in the Kursk. Oh my, somebody asked me to help them promote a raffle for like little like town center keys from Kursk. Like the Ukrainians are like, they're happy to be having these battles not in their own towns. They're happy to be on the offensive again and be moving, and the soldiers are happy to not having to be driving in minefields all the time. There's a morale boost that has come from this. There is the possibility of leverage that comes with this, and we'll talk about the leverage and negotiating territory for territory in a second. But I wanted to talk about long range strikes because some might think that, okay, they've just invaded across the border, occupied villages. Well, if Russia's not going to start World War III over occupying their own villages, they're not going to start World War III for the Ukrainians using a Western-provided bomb to destroy the airfield that bombed a children's hospital. So the question from me to you is, because why do you think is there any logic to it? Because the only thing I heard that made any sense to me is that, and I think this was a report from CNN, I forget, somebody can go look it up, is that they're fearful that if they were to allow these types of strikes, it would make it difficult to de-thaw relations down the line, is what one report coming around is.
Yeah, the White House has subsequently, I've seen that report, and the White House came out and said, we have no idea where this came from, because the report said, it would make it harder to do a reset with Russia. And the White House came out and went, absolutely none of us are thinking about a reset with Russia. That's the dumbest thing we've ever heard. So
it's good to hear that. I didn't hear that update. I'm happy to hear that. Happy.
Yeah, me too. I was like, oh, thank God. Nobody's out there with like that button Hillary Clinton flew to
reset
to
button
Russia.
version 2.
Except it didn't say, I remember this at the time where they like mistranslated it, and they translated the word reset literally, and it said something really dumb. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But you asked a really good question. I mean, I'm inclined to agree with you. I'm like, the Ukrainians hit Moscow with drones, and they are lighting up oil refineries and airfields all over Russia, and they have been for 18 months.
Every other day. It's like at first it was once in a while, but now it's like every day I wake up and I see oil refineries. Like it's the Gulf War all over again.
And I'm like, so talk me through it. This idea is that like Putin wakes up on Tuesday and he's like, 2 of my oil refineries and 1 of my air bases is on fire, but it was hit by Ukrainian Baba Yaga drones or something. I'm not going to nuke, but now I'm receiving reports that on Wednesday they hit one of these refineries with, like a storm shadow. Now I'm going to end all life on Earth, and now I'm going to escalate. I'm like, that doesn't track for me. Fundamentally, Ukrainians have demonstrated that you can hit targets in deep, deep Russia with big booms without triggering World War III. The Russians do not react with nuclear weapons because that would be an insane escalation for a drone hitting an oil refinery. That's not even break glass in case of emergency. That is eat glass in case of emergency. It's insane. So I don't truck it. I think, with that said, the most generous thing from a diplomatic standpoint I can say about the agonizing US and European strategy of drip feeding arms to Ukraine is that was the messaging in and of itself. It is not that they actually believed that each additional package of weapons was going to be the one that triggered World War III, but there was a decision that it was important to send to Russia and to the Kremlin the message that the West is aware that escalation is a possibility and is taking active steps to manage it, that Putin is not going to wake up one morning and find that Ukraine is full of F-35s and Model 2 Abrams piloted by Ukrainians with suspiciously California accents.
Buzzkill.
Exactly. Sorry.
Also, Westside Tyler, thank you so much for the raid. I appreciate it. Continue.
That was kind of it. Raid away, friends. If Vorsh can raid you, Ukrainians can raid Belgorod. This is my in-depth military analysis.
Well, what would you say about the people who? Because I've heard it's different because these weapons are harder to intercept, carry heavier payloads, and would end up doing more damage. And so it would propose a different type of crisis for Russian airfields, different type of crisis for different pieces of Russian infrastructure. And I mean, that to me, that just sounds like people complaining about the fact that it would be better at doing the job that needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree. There was the I can't remember their name, but the oil fire, the oil container fire that burnt for 5 days and burnt down half a city. It's just whatever the Ukrainians sent to set that oil refinery or oil storage on fire managed to start a fire that burnt for a week, injured 35 firefighters. The Russians still couldn't put it out. And it burnt the outer suburbs of a town, and you're okay, so the next missile's going to be a little bit bigger, and that fire might be big booms have happened, and World War III didn't start. So I don't know. The really nice thing about having this opinion is that if I'm wrong, people will have very little time to gloat about it. So it's just kind of a safe opinion to have because I'm not the one making these decisions, no one's going to be able to say I told you so.
I'll be on Twitter refreshing every second until annihilation, making sure nobody quote tweets me gotcha.
Yeah, this is listen. If the nukes are in the air, I'm being horny on main. I've waited long enough. I've carefully curated my presence. Surely, if we're all gonna die, I'm just thirst posting right there on main.
One last moment of freedom before the end.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
I from my view, I don't understand if the Biden administration has gotten to the position where it believes that striking across the border is okay after the Russians tried to act cheeky in Kharkiv by using the border to just be right over the border with its artillery, keeping it out of range of Western weapons. Why would this logic not extend to the airfields that are bombing children's hospitals, bombing military air bases? It doesn't make any sense to me, even more so in the fallout of the Kursk incursion. Do you think that in the long run, Washington is going to make the decision to allow these strikes with Western weapons on Russian air bases?
I suspect that's where we're headed. Again, this gets a little bit into the genuine red line, which is that some of these air bases will house Russian strategic aviation, which is part of the Russian nuclear triad. So you do get to the point where you do have a theoretical possibility that the Ukrainians are directly attacking a part of the Russian nuclear deterrent. But we're at 7 degrees of, not abstraction, but a distant dream. So I ultimately think we'll get there. I also think Ukraine has just announced that it's pretty close to rolling out its first homemade ballistic missile. So there is also a fungibility element to this, where you could use U.S. equipment domestically while hammering the Russians with Ukrainian homemade drones and Ukrainian missiles. And by the way, we don't know what the US is quietly handing over to the Ukrainians in terms of knowledge, expertise, and know-how. The Ukrainians are very, very capable in and of themselves, but I would imagine if the CIA is doing its job, they have the blueprints for Shaheds sitting on their desks and have them for a year and a half.
muted. Is there anything stopping Washington from putting the ball in the Russians' court by saying, okay, we understand that you don't want to threaten your nuclear triad or whatever air bases you use to bomb Ukraine, we consider those fair game. And then if you don't use those, then it would put the ball in the Russians' court to make the decision, okay, we don't want this nuclear triad air base to be threatened, so we're not going to use it, therefore will not be struck with Western weapons. And it would put the ball in their court where they would have to make these calls for themselves. We would allow them to make decisions that could avoid them putting their nuclear, the infrastructure needed to support their nuclear response under threat.
Yeah, I mean, if I was in the Kremlin, my counter chess move is you say that to me, I say no. The way we interpret this is any attack on elements of the Russian nuclear triad we consider to be intensely escalatory, and you are playing with fire, and then I start deploying strategic bombers to every airfield I bomb Ukraine with, so that forcing the US into a position where it has to either hold the Ukrainians back or accept the risk of hitting elements of the Russian nuclear triad. So there is a kind of game of chicken element here that you open up with that kind of phrasing. I personally don't think the US should be the first ones to say the words nuclear triad out loud, because part of it is like the Russians will never admit where their nuclear triad directly is. So at any time you can go, well, yeah, we hit that airfield. How are we supposed to know you keep your nuclear bombers there? That's one of the most closely guarded secrets, in theory, of the Russian military.
So could it just be restrained to something along the lines of like, whatever air bases you use to bomb Ukraine, we would consider fair game to be hit with Western weapons. Then you would also still allow them, if they were genuinely fearful of their nuclear infrastructure being damaged in some capacity, because who knows if they have the ability to repair it at this point with where their economy is, then they could legitimately make strategic decisions to account to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add that the actual Russian nuclear triad is not heavily dependent on those strategic bombers, because I don't think Russia's under any illusions that it could successfully fly bombers over US strategic targets or over the US mainland, maybe over Europe, but not even then. The Russian nuclear deterrent is based on ICBMs that are land-based and the Russian nuclear submarine fleet. So this would be kabuki regardless. It's not like if you could snap your fingers and like wipe out every Russian strategic bomber that they have tomorrow, they would still be more than capable of wiping out all life on Earth with their nuclear arsenal. So this is all just kind of silly and kind of gamesmanship and sort of weird posturing anyway. But no, I hear what you're saying. I think it's an entirely legitimate thing to go like, yeah, no, the Ukrainians are going to hit. Of course, they're going to hit the places you're bombing their hospitals.
Shoot the archer, not the arrow. Is the philosophy, yeah.
And we're not going to micromanage them while they do it. That's an entirely reasonable position.
It's just hard for me as an American to imagine, like, on one hand, we don't give them enough air defense to shoot down all the arrows, but on the other hand, we're restricting them at shooting the archer. And you have to choose one or the other if the goal here is for Ukraine to end up with the best leverage possible when whatever negotiations come around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, there's no answer. It's just like they are. The only way to extend that metaphor is if you feel like that archer is wearing a giant suicide belt, and you're like 90% sure he's not going to pull the string because you think he loves his life as the richest person on Earth, possibly, and his gilded sort of throne, but you're never 1,000% certain. Exactly.
The best. I wanted to ask you about because there's been some speculation that Ukraine is going to stay in Kursk, is going to hold on to the territory, and is then going to try to trade it back for its own land back. Some people have talked about the land around Kharkiv. I don't know if it would be maybe for more land. I mean, from the Ukrainian perspective, they maybe would think like, well, one of these villages is much more worth to you than, all of this land. Well, who knows how they're going to ask it or leverage it, where one village is worth 5 Ukrainian villages. Who knows? But if this is well, first let me ask you, is this feasible as a diplomatic move, I'm not asking you to be a strategist here, but diplomatically, do you think it's a feasible strategy to advance? And how much leverage could something like this give the Ukrainians, do you think?
So Ukraine has had a problem for a long time in that it feels like it is constantly under an uncertain shot clock, which is at what point do its Western partners start escalating the pressure on it to enter into negotiations? That is one. That is something that Ukraine is constantly agonizing over, because that could happen at any time, and the degree of pressure could go from mild to sort of semi-existential.
And that pressure is really big right now with the election as well.
Yeah, although, yeah, I mean, it's depending on how that goes, but it could be a lot worse than it is. At this point, nobody has yet, at least who's actually in power, has turned around and said that if we don't think you're engaged in, like, good faith, open, generous negotiations for a ceasefire or to end this, we will stop sending you weapons. No one said that yet, but Ukrainians live in horror of the day that happens, and you can never rule it out. There, but for the grace of a couple of elections in a couple of places, go we. So that's kind of problem one. The attached problem to that is that if you picture negotiations, the problem is that they are historically incredibly unbalanced, because what is on the table, if you think about what both sides could possibly offer, it is effectively comes down to like a discussion of how much Ukrainian territory Russia gets to keep. And that's on like one side of the equation. And on the other side of the equation is like Russia agrees to stop murdering you for a while. Now that's not the basis of a normal negotiation. It is really hard to negotiate when the only things on the table are your side's interests, which is how that negotiation has been positioned. It's like, what we're going to discuss is how much of my shit you get, and the only thing that you are offering is to stop hitting me. Which you can resume hitting me at any time, by the way, after we do this. So that's been the Ukrainian perception has been like, A, we could get pushed into negotiating, and B, if we were pushed into negotiating the way we are now, that negotiation would see us would have limited leverage, because the Russians would know we're being pushed to that table, and B, the only things that were beyond that table is shit we care about, and not like Russian. There's no pain for Russia involved. So this is my very, very long way of saying anything Ukraine can do to balance those scales, to have something that Russia wants from Ukraine other than just Ukrainian territory, is a win, because that becomes negotiating coin. You can sort of think about sanctions relief in this basket. You can think of prisoner exchanges. You can think of, previously Ukraine had to scramble to come up with stuff like, we will offer not to join NATO, or we will offer not to join the European Union. Those would be examples of the kind of things that like Russia might want, that Ukraine could conceivably think of in order to not have to put more of its territory on the table. And that is a bad place to be in. So by taking Kursk and by threatening other zones, Ukraine potentially in a future negotiation creates more negotiating coin for itself. That would mean that it can't be pushed to give up quite as much territory. There's a way to cobble together some sort of deal that involves Ukraine giving up less territory. However, and this is like the unsolvable fucking part of this, right? Which is that you absolutely can't trust Putin to hold to any agreement he signs. He simply does not hold as a value fidelity to written treaties. The only enforcement mechanism anybody can invent for how to keep Russia true to its word is security guarantees from the West. And I'm not talking about arms shipments. I'm talking about NATO basically says, if you sign this ceasefire, we will be its security guarantors. If Russia violates it, we will respond with force. The West is categorically unwilling to do that, and so is everybody else. And there's just, I can't think of how you square
I
that.
think Zelensky's position was most clearly defined. I think it was like 2 years ago I heard him saying something like this, where, when he offered to enter the presidency, I don't think he really defined himself that much by the war. He talked about a little bit around the war, but it was very little. It mostly had to do with anti-corruption. He was, in a way, a Molotov to the Ukrainian political establishment in some way. And he didn't get there by mostly talking about the war. But since he was, the country's been invaded, since he's experienced the war, I remember him saying that he sees his role in history as ending the cycle of Russia's repeated invasions, re-invasions, reconquests of Ukraine that have happened throughout Ukraine's national history since its idea came into existence, after, and around the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth time. For hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, this has been going on. And he wants to end the cycle. But the only way you can end the cycle and be guaranteed you can end the cycle is if you make it impossible for the Russians to invade, unless you're basing it truly on their good faith. And the only way you could do that is by making it so that if they invaded, there was no chance of victory. And they know that there's no chance of victory by things like NATO membership. But that is what Russia is fighting desperately to stop. And so it feels like, to me, even though we're hearing a lot about negotiations, and while I'm back in the States, before I go back this weekend, I hear a lot about negotiations, it really doesn't feel like we're any closer at all.
Yeah, listen, I'm inclined to agree. The only way Ukraine has security guarantees is either if the Russian military is so badly mauled, and that coincides with a basically like collapse of the Russian economy, or at least a massive, massive degradation of the Russian economy, to the point where for like a decade, there is the sense that Russia could not meaningfully threaten Ukraine even if it wanted to. So there is a scenario where you kill them so hard that you buy yourself time to fortify Ukraine or like go through the process of joining NATO. Or short of that, somebody offers genuine security guarantees. Those are the only two ways that I can see Ukraine being like, okay, we can accept that this is lasting peace.
Okay. What are things that people should be looking out for the rest of the year that you're keeping an eye on news-wise?
God, there's a lot going on. I mean, the US elections are going to suck up a huge amount of oxygen, understandably so. Who runs the free world
You're supporting Trump, yes?
matters quite a bit. Oh, of course.
Okay.
I'm actually supporting RFK Jr.'s brainworm. I believe that should be sworn in as POTUS on like a tiny brainworm version of the.
I don't know. I mean, we want a president with high energy, and if you're RFK's brainworm, you're going to be extremely malnourished.
So you're hungry. There's benefits to being hungry. So obviously that's really important. I do some podcasting and stuff with guys called International Intrigue that do kind of daily free summaries of news. I'd really recommend people check them out. They're fantastic. I'll drop a link to Dylan later. But they basically it's a bunch of my former diplomat friends who are like, here's what's going on in the world. By far the most interesting things to watch are what is happening with the Chinese economy, because it's bad. It's really bad. A bunch of Chinese provinces basically most Chinese provinces are effectively bankrupt. The sort of Chinese federal government has not figured out a way how to get sort of spruce demand. There's a whole bunch of legacy economic factors. They can't attract foreign direct investment anymore because the business environment has become hostile, plus the looming threat of a trade war with the US is scaring away investors. So it's
Do you think that's one of the reasons why, and we're going to cover this probably when you leave, but recently President Xi was talking about how they're desiring a quote-unquote stable relationship with the United States. They're as fiery and as toothy as ever on the issue of Taiwan and, of course, of reunification. But it seems that they don't like looking down the barrel of economic abyss.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can trace the bellicosity of Chinese rhetoric really cleanly based on like how confident they're feeling in their economy. So in 2020, when they thought they had defeated COVID by themselves, when they thought they were economically unstoppable, when they were rolling out One Belt, One Road like worldwide, and everybody was, everything in Africa was a Chinese highway. They felt invincible, and their sort of the level of threat and their like aggressiveness, not just towards the US, but towards even US allies, was astronomical. My friends who were posted at embassies in Beijing didn't get a meeting with the government for 3 years because the Chinese government was like, we don't have to talk to you. We don't particularly like you. We are unstoppable Middle Kingdom China. We are on the ascendancy. We are going to run the world. We do not have to talk to you. We do not have to engage with you. We don't have to engage with anybody. When things didn't quite work out that way, a couple of years later, they noticed that on the one hand, the tightening of domestic controls, which they did for domestic reasons, combined with like macroeconomic factors, combined with this bellicosity abroad, has started to really drag on their economy. Suddenly you see them trying to send much more positive signals to investors and to the global community. Basically, they're trying to tell the global business community and global finance, China's still cool. We're not going to do anything crazy. We're not going to pick fights. We're still a stable place to spend $1 trillion to build 50 factories. Please come.
For all the talk of like failure of sanctions, one area that it has been successful does seem to be in scaring Chinese banks and companies from facilitating business with Russia. And it is really angering the Kremlin quite a lot that the Chinese aren't willing to stick out their economic neck for them. But I mean, it's not really much they can do. It's within their economic self-interest not to lose the largest consumer economy in the world.
The fact that sort of, for all of the glorious talks about BRICS solidarity and like, the unstoppable alliance of super friends, there's the BRICS. The fact of the matter is that when push came to shove, the BRICS relationship with Russia, whether it was Chinese companies being unwilling to risk US secondary sanctions, or India effectively just being like, no, we'll buy your oil, but only at bargain basement extortionate prices. All of that proved completely transactional, and there was no underlying core of loyalty there at all. And yeah, it really annoys the Kremlin because it turns out the Kremlin is terrible at statecraft. If you find yourself in a war with one of your neighbors and that neighbor gets to call in as allies the entire free world, and you light the beacons of Gondor, and the only ones who ride to your aid are North Korea and Iran, that is, you have fucked up at diplomacy. Like you're not getting that like civ diplomatic victory.
No.
You've screwed, because they're bad at this. And they've been bad at it for a long time. And they've gotten away with being bad at it because of like historical prestige and because of their size and because people thought their army was scary. But they're terrible. They're really bad at making friends because everybody who looks at them can see that they are transactional gangsters. And their relationships are those of transactional, organized crime lords. And that is not the basis of deep ties. That is the basis of short-term convenience that you cast away as soon as it ceases to be convenient.
Okay, so I have one last question for you because I do stream mostly to Americans and you're a non-American. How do foreigners view the 2024 election from the outside? How does it look, and how does it look to the foreign policy community that you're viewing? Like, what either like number one, the spectacle, and number two, the potential consequences.
Yeah, God.
Last question, I swear.
No. This is I'm not on like where to even begin with that question. I think everybody's politics looks insane from outside, but everybody is baffled by your politics and like different aspects of it. The fact that the entire election is going to be functionally
Is everybody
decided
really
by
that jealous?
yeah, like yes, well, everybody watched the
my
West
my,
Wing,
fav-
and
my
thought that was
favorite
awesome.
my main problem is that we couldn't have Biden and Joe both be president.
Yeah. Although, with that said, if you guys want to spare us Michelle Obama, we'll take her. She doesn't want to be president of the US. Maybe she wants to be, Prime Minister of Australia. It's a pretty cruisy job. Um, no, so outside, it's like bafflement over how your politics works. Bafflement. It is really hard externally to watch Donald Trump and wrap your head around the fact that it's a toss-up. Because we're not in the trenches of it.
Was it
and
worse
because
though a few weeks ago when it didn't even feel like a toss-up?
Yeah, well, that was just depressing. Everybody here was on kind of crying watch. But I'll tell you what, from a diplomatic perspective, when Trump was heavily up, just as with the first Trump term, I can tell you what every foreign ministry in the world was thinking. How do we pander to this guy's ego and bribe him into making sure we're not on his shit list? That is how Australia approached him. When Donald Trump was sworn in, the Australian Prime Minister was one of the first ones who got a phone call to him. And the way they did it was because we got Greg Norman, the famous golfer. Greg Norman had Trump's personal cell phone number. And the Australian Foreign Service got him to give it to us so that we could be one of the first, countries to talk to Trump and kiss the ring.
Wow, beautiful.
That is people are buying suites in Mar-a-Lago. People are sort of booking out Trump hotels. People are buying stock in that stupid DJT company that he holds. Wait,
Australians are doing the buying stuff at Trump Hotel? I know the Saudis did that. The Saudis bought rooms at Trump Hotel.
Australians can't afford it. So we can't afford to do, we can't be quite that brazen, but we can come close. Everybody is thinking in these terms because there's kind of, yes, it's all very depressing and existential and yada, 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 but your job is to advance the national interest, and you don't do that by taking grand moral stands. You do it by playing the field as it is. So the way that a lot of people are viewing a potential Trump presidency is as a massively disruptive, massively depressing event that you have to actively manage by being shameless and corrupt in the way that his administration responds to. And, that's one of those things that should be worrying to Americans, because I promise you, if Australians are thinking that way, others are thinking about it in a far less scrupulous way, if that's how we're approaching it. So that's kind of how we look at it. Now I think people are feeling optimism, but part of the challenge is we're very aware of the fact that our perception of the US comes filtered through terminally online hyper-political people, because that's who talks about it and writes about it and has Twitch streams on a Thursday night about it.
Yep.
What is really hard, and what my American friends often tell me, is it is so hard to understand how disconnected the average American is from all this. That the guys on Twitter who are yelling at each other, the people at the rallies are this tiny percentage of the country, and then most people haven't even tuned into the election yet.
Historically, it's after Labor Day, so it's probably going to be in the next few weeks, people will probably start being okay, I should probably figure out who I'm voting for. A lot of people have already made up their minds in the camps, but that's traditionally how it works.
And like that's insane to the rest of us because those of us who kind of follow this stuff, it's always like this running joke that I couldn't tell you who my like member of parliament in Australia is, but I can tell you what like percentage is needed to flip the Georgia 6th. Like it's that kind of, and that's like a lot of people in Australia like obsessed with US politics are like that. So for us, for who like live and breathe this shit and have like Pod Save America hooked to our veins and a spam refreshing political Twitter and, you know, watching political Twitch streams and getting involved. For us,
And subscribing to Dylan Burns TV for only $5 a month.
Absolutely. For only $5 a month, it's a steal at half the price. Exactly. Like the 2020 election, it's a steal.
Absolutely.
If you guys could just steal it again, there was that poll that came out where they like polled people on like, do you think the 2020 election was stolen? And they like grouped it by categories. And 2% of Harris voters think the 2020 election was stolen.
Yes.
And I just love those
people. Those were the guys that stole it.
They're like, we're gonna fucking, we're gonna do it again.
We're gonna do it again.
Yeah.
Okay. I forgot I wanted to ask this. I just realized I really should ask you this question because you're the only Australian I can ask about this. Paul Keating.
Cool.
He's a former Australian Prime Minister. Did you see his beef with Nancy Pelosi over Taiwan?
Yeah.
So could you describe the situation and then give your opinion on it? Or I could describe the situation for those. I mean, you can if you want. You're Australian, so you probably know Paul Keating better than I do.
We've had a couple of prime ministers who are utterly convinced of their own genius and unshakably convinced of their own genius, who have gone on to like do stuff, and Paul Keating's one of them. As best as I can understand it, and please correct me, I didn't follow this because it's exhausting, but Nancy Pelosi had the very famous visit to Taiwan, the first by a Speaker of the House in forever.
Yes.
That was, the Chinese pretended that would be hugely escalatory and did what they always do, which is freak out.
Well, they did fire some missiles at the ocean, and it made me, I like to always say these situations, I like to read them out loud, depoliticized, and reduce them down, and I think 84-year-old woman flies to Taipei, Chinese angry, shoots at ocean. It's ridiculous when you think about it, but yeah, that's basically where it ended.
Yeah, and listen, I should say this is part of a much broader and overall very effective Chinese diplomatic strategy, which everyone in the Foreign Service has experienced, which is the Chinese figured out that the way that you get the world to respect your sensitivities and your weird picadillos and your weird obsessions is by not having any kind of volume, by not having any setting that's under a 10. So they flip the fuck out over the most minor shit imaginable. Like quite literally, so I used to represent Australia at the WTO. If
World Trade Organization for all of you who live under a diplomatic rock.
If we ever use the word country to describe WTO members, or use the word ambassadors to describe the full collection of representatives to the WTO, the Chinese would immediately make complaints at like a very high level, because Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau are all WTO members. And so the Chinese are obsessed with the fact that you can't call them countries because they don't think Taiwan's a country. And they flip out over this to like the 11th degree. The UN has officers in some places where the Chinese have influence that will go through invitation lists to like open workshops and veto anybody who looks like they're from Chinese Taipei, because the Chinese will freak out at the Secretary General of the office. It's very funny. Your cat's patrolling behind you. My dog's patrolling back and forth behind me. They're like
standing guard.
Exactly. So China's had this very, very effective strategy of like, if we treat everything like it is the end of the world, people will self-censor and tiptoe around our sensitivities because they don't want the fire. And so part of the thing is like with Pelosi, they didn't have that much room to escalate Because if you treat like buying the Dalai Lama lunch as DEFCON 1, and then Nancy Pelosi flies to Chinese Taipei, you don't have that much, short of actually launching missiles at Pelosi.
Yeah, I saw one propagandist say, "Who knows? Maybe we should shoot down the plane." And I saw people on Twitter, of course, because this is always how it works, reposting like, "State media says China will shoot down plane," but it was never going to escalate to those levels because, like, who's going to start World War III over this frail old woman going to Taipei saying, "I like the Taiwan," and then flying back home, which is what she did.
Yeah, it was, I mean, and so Keating is one of these people who firmly believes in, like, you can't poke the Chinese bear, we have to find a rapprochement. So he gives her a hard time for being escalatory, and she mostly ignores.
Did you hear what he said though? Specifically, he said that Taiwan was Chinese real estate, and she responded by basically just saying, like, she basically like brushed him off almost, which I don't think he took it well.
I mean, on the scale of relevance, a former and like very former, keep in mind this guy hasn't been
in the 90s, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, I don't know, if Jimmy Carter came out and like had some statement about, I don't know,
Bill Clinton, I guess.
Macron, would Macron be that incensed?
No, I don't really think so. Definitely, since like Nancy Pelosi just basically led a pressure campaign that changed the Democratic Party's nominee for president. What is Paul Keating doing?
Exactly. I mean, listen, I wouldn't. I think it's funny, but it's I wouldn't dwell on it beyond just like laughing at this guy.
I just thought I just didn't know much about him, so I wanted to ask you, since this is Australian news, so I needed you to be my token. Thank you so much for coming on tonight, man. I really appreciate it. You went out of your way, and I do appreciate it. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? And you wrote a book.
I did. I'm Dmitry Opines on Twitter, which I think you've been linking to in chat, or your very diligent chat mod I have seen has been moderating. So thank you very much, J. Dean, if I'm getting that right, J. Dean Ryan. So thank you very much for doing that. And I read a book called Why Politicians Lie About Trade, which is basically me speaking in this exact way about how trade policy works and how to tell when people are lying to you about stuff like tariffs. So yeah, please do check it out.
Thank you so much for coming on, and you have a blessed rest of your week.
You too, stay safe and keep doing what you're doing. It's invaluable.
Thank you, man. You too, man. Bye-bye.
See ya.
If you guys have any ideas, you can tell me about them at DylanBurnsTV@gmail.com.